Hello, doubters. For many of us, science and faith seem to be at odds with one another. So, how do we square our interpretations of Scripture with our interpretations of the natural sciences? One of the most significant conflicts we face is the one of the origins of humans. The current scientific models seem to leave no room for Adam and Eve. We will pose that question to scientist Dr. Joshua Swamidas, who has literally written the book on the topic on this episode. Dr. Swamidas, MD, PhD, is a physician, scientist, and associate professor of laboratory and genomic medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. He leads a computational biological group that studies information at the intersection of biology, chemistry, and medicine. He is also a speaker for the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and the Veritas Forum. He recently served as a science advisor for the AAAS Science and Seminaries and now blogs at Peaceful Science. Dr. Swamidas is the author of a new book titled The Genealogical Adam and Eve. Here he tests a scientific hypothesis. What if the traditional account is somehow true, with the origins of Adam and Eve taking place alongside evolution? Dr. Swamidas, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be able to talk to you about this.
Yes, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on, and I think this is a significant issue for those of us that are deconstructing, so I'm interested in your thesis and your insight into this topic.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, the data bears that out. David McKinnon wrote a book called You Lost Me, where he looked at the top reasons why people left the church in the United States. And one of the top reasons was science. And
Yep.
And if you go and poke into that, you'll see that people were really uncomfortable with how the church just really seemed to have overconfidence and answers in conflict with science. And they were turned off by the evolution creation debate.
Yeah.
And the big rubbing point in that debate, even though people talk about things like the Cambrian explosion and such, but the real issue has always been about Adam and Eve and human origins and who we are.
Right.
And how do we match what Scripture says about who we are versus what science says who we are?
Well, we are going to get to that really important question, but I want you to kind of sketch out from your perspective, what was your view of Adam and Eve and how they fit with the scientific paradigm before you started to research for your book?
Oh, well, I'd always been, let's put it this way, not always. I'd been raised a young earth creationist, which is like a common way people read Genesis, right?
Right.
But the problem is that I was really made for science, and I was really drawn to it. And from a really young age, I was just get exposed to it, and I just really sensed and felt that conflict. And it was a real point of difficulty for me. But as I learned more about science and got to see the evidence for myself, and also learn more about Scripture, and actually read Genesis for myself rather than relying on what people told me it said, actually looking at what it actually said, I started to move to a position much more aligned with mainstream science. And I just found myself to be a profound skeptic of the conflict. I just couldn't understand why it was people thought there was a conflict. I mean, I had some big questions in my mind about some precise scientific details, but the reasons why people said there was a conflict didn't actually match what I knew about science. And they were saying, well, science tells us X, but I'm like, but no, actually that's not actually what mainstream science shows. And when I started researching my book, I started researching the book before I realized I was going to be writing a book. It was just a response to a book by a then colleague of mine who had really made an argument against Adam and Eve. And I read the book and I said, man, the science on this is just really not correct. And so I was writing a review of it and looking into that more closely. And that just really ended up really kicking a hornet's nest, because it turns out that my skepticism back then in 2017 and before was not well appreciated by others. Everyone else thought it was a solved problem, that there was a fundamental conflict, and that's just been certain.
Right.
And my skepticism was just so profoundly confusing to people. I ended up being boxed into writing this book.
Well, let me just say that it's a fascinating book. It's an amazing read. I remember my wife is a physician's assistant, so she's also in the medical field. And as I was listening to your book and kind of grappling with some of the points, I explained what your general thesis of the book was, and she was like, "Hold on, wait a second." Like, and she started asking me a series of questions, and I'm like, "Babe, you got to read the book. It's really good." So can you, so I'm encouraging people ultimately to read the book, but can you just briefly kind of sketch out your thesis there, your general idea in the book?
Yeah, well, the basic idea is that maybe the traditional readings of Genesis, which I'll define in just a moment, are entirely consistent with, happening in the same physical reality, with what we find in science. It's just that they're different, describing that same physical reality in different ways. And not to be very specific, I mean, because some people will say things like that and then go on and take a very figurative view of Adam and Eve. That's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
I'm talking about Adam and Eve, just as recent as 6,000 years ago. That you could have them more ancient if you want.
Right.
Ancestors of all of us, and also de novo created, meaning without parents. So without parents, okay. And if you'll notice, that's how most people have read Genesis through most of history.
Right.
That, in that sense, it's traditional, and also it's beyond just that. Many aspects of that, though not all of it, have made its way into core confessions across the church. Core one there is ancestors of us all. That's not explicitly stated in Genesis, but that comes from trying to put together coherent theology, including the New Testament, particularly Romans and 1 Corinthians and Acts. Mm-hmm. And just most of the church has really understood Adam and Eve that way. Now, what you'll notice is that there's silence about a really critical fact that's necessary to assess this scientifically. There's silence in the traditional account. There's a question mark. There's a mystery about whether or not there were people outside the garden. It turns out for thousands of years, it's part of the Genesis tradition to wonder about Cain's wife, to wonder about people outside the garden. And so my crazy idea is that maybe that account is entirely consistent with evolutionary science. And I'm not doing anything funny here. There's no pseudoscience involved. Actually, the science in my book ends up getting endorsed by Nathaniel Lentz. Even though evolutionary creationists completely disagree with this approach, they have finally conceded that actually the science is correct in it. And they're reassessing how to approach this, and it's to that point where even people who disagree with it on theological grounds, like Jerry Coyne,
right,
and others, will concede, well, the science here is really good. It just turns out that our best estimates say that if there was for any couple living in the Middle East about 6,000 years ago, our best estimates show that they would be ancestors of everyone before Jesus walked the earth. and that just changes a lot of stuff. It just turns out that where we thought there was a fundamental conflict about the factual claims about the physical world between traditional Christianity, between science, there just wasn't, and that completely aligned with the range acceptable within traditional Christianity. Maybe Adam and Eve really were essentially the young Earth creationist reading of Genesis, just taken more literally than the young Earth creationist would.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I do want to get to the question of Cain's wife, but we'll leave that for a little bit, just so the audience is aware. We'll kind of talk about some maybe scientific understandings where Dr. Swamidas is at with some of those things, and then we'll in the latter half of the show we'll talk more of the theological details, which I think are really, really great.
And I think the key thing for listeners to really grasp is that the key thing here is that it does mean that there will be people outside the garden that Adam and Eve's lineage interbred with. And that raises interesting theological questions, which I think that's the fun of it from here.
Yeah, totally. So you may have already answered this, but what was one of the most surprising things from your perspective as you were researching and writing this book?
I think it was surprising to me how Oh man, there's a lot of surprises through the story. I was really surprised by the amount of resistance I got, primarily from Christians to this, that affirmed evolution. That was very surprising to me. I realized a lot of them actually were deconstructing their faith, and
Hmm.
part of their identity was on in affirming science over traditional Christianity. Um, and so the idea that maybe there wasn't a conflict between traditional Christianity and science really seemed to be very difficult for a lot of them, and they've been very hostile to the idea at times. In fact, they've been some of the biggest opponents of it. Even as they agreed with the science, it would really come down to them really wanting to reject traditional Christianity and really feeling the loss of a big weapon they had against it.
Yeah. 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 And again, for anyone that's watching, where you're probably nodding your head and saying, yeah, that is a significant issue in the church that I was either raised in, or one of the reasons I'm deconstructing, we hear you, and we're going to talk more about it. One of the central points in your book is this difference between a genetic ancestor and a genealogical ancestor. So explain the two different categories and why they're significant in this conversation.
Yeah, so this is a key place where there's been an equivocation or a mix up in terms, because there's different ways of understanding ancestry. Two ways of understanding it is genetic ancestry, which is how most scientists emphasize, without denying others. That's just what they mean. If you talk about ancestry, they're going to talk about genetics, which is really the templating history of individual strands of DNA. And if that sounds kind of like jargon, well, it is, and it is a very strange scientific way of understanding ancestry. We can do a lot of cool things with it, but it isn't an ordinary understanding of ancestry. An ordinary understanding of ancestry is genealogical, or the idea of parents begetting offspring, or a chain of biological descent. And that's a very different type of ancestry that in some cases corresponds with genetics, but in other cases doesn't. So a great example of this is, you can infer, for example, you can do a paternity test to find out who your parents are or your father is. But the key thing to remember, though, is that you're only 50% your parents. I mean, your father, you only get 50% of your DNA from your father and only 50% from your mother, even though you're 100% their son and 100% their daughter.
Right.
And you go back, so what happening with genetics is that you go back every generation, it's diluting. Or if you go forward every generation, it's diluting too.
Right.
And that's okay. That's just how the world works. But that's just not what we mean when we talk about genealogical ancestry. And so Scripture isn't talking about genetics. I mean, everyone should agree with that. I mean, the only people who are really committed at this point to a genetic understanding of Christian human origins, it seems, are people who are really intent on a particular theological agenda, either against evolution or against the Bible, because Scripture itself can't really be talking about genetics. But maybe it does talk about genealogical ancestry. Maybe the tradition does say that we all are genealogical ancestors of Adam and Eve. So when that frame shift, we find out that there is actually science out there about how rapidly genealogical ancestry spreads, and it turns out it spreads out really rapidly. Even though mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, which have nothing to do with Scripture, appear over 100,000 years in the past. Recent genealogical ancestors of everyone alive, for example, appear probably about the same time that Jesus walked the earth, about 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And so that's just a very stunning fact. I mean, I was skeptical about the conflict. What I didn't realize is that it was going to make space for an Adam and Eve as recent as 6,000 years ago. I was fully prepared. Well, maybe Adam and Eve were more ancient, 10,000 years. Maybe they are. Maybe there's other reasons to think that they're more ancient. But it has really nothing to do with any challenge from genetics that pushes us back there. It's other concerns that would have us really think about that.
Right. And I've heard other, philosophers and theologians, particularly William Lane Craig, mention that it's due to, archaeological type evidences that he would date Adam much later. And in your conversation with him, you're kind of like, yeah, totally possible. So give me your thoughts on kind
I
of
think
some of that.
One place where people misunderstand is they think that there's a fundamental disagreement between Bill Craig and I. Maybe. I mean, I can tell you where we disagree. But in the genealogical Adam and Eve, I really map out a range of possibilities that has Adam as recent as 6,000 years ago or more ancient. And his book is coming out really soon.
Yeah, September, I think.
And his book actually adopts a version of the genealogical Adam and Eve. He thinks it's that genealogical ancestry from Adam and Eve is most important. And what pushes it back is not anything in genetics. It just has to do with the appearance of humanness in the fossil record, what he sees as humanness in the fossil record about 700,000 years ago. Now, here's the key point, though. This is where there is a disagreement, but this is also, I would say, maybe a third order disagreement. It's not a first order or a second, a third order disagreement. I just don't understand why he is boxed in to thinking that all humanness has to derive from Adam and Eve. It seems like there's several ways to make sense of humanness in the fossil record before Adam and Eve that I don't really think he's like fully considered or really ruled out. That's where the disagreement is. But in the end, I mean, I don't really care as a scientist if he thinks about Adam and Eve that late. It's certainly not in conflict with the evidence.
Right. No, that's really interesting. So I want to kind of probe your, worldview, if you will, on some other views of science from a Christian perspective. So one of the other kind of camps that's out there, other than, let's say creationism, whether it's old Earth or young Earth, is this kind of ID movement. And one of the large disagreements, or one of the evidences against evolution, is this thing called the waiting time problem, which I'll try to do my best to sum it up. Where I get it incorrect, please correct me. The waiting time problem, essentially, as I understand it, is that based on malaria mutations, we don't have enough time and enough population to get from apes to man in even a old Earth perspective. So that calls into question something like a common ancestry or a common descent model in the traditional evolution paradigm. So how would you view some of those
to argue
things?
That would be to disagree. So you're citing Michael Behe in The Edge of Evolution. Okay.
Yep.
Well, to argue that would actually be to disagree with Michael Behe himself. He actually thinks that there's no biochemical evidence for God's intervention and in humans because it completely is consistent with natural evolution, the data we see, except specifically in philosophical questions that arise that have nothing to do with biochemistry, just about the rise of a fully human mind. I mean, that's actually a fairly standard Catholic position that has nothing to do with ID. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I'd want to know if a person is going to make that argument, well, why do you disagree with Behe on that? The one who actually did. And then secondly, to understand why Behe does that is because I think he's recognized actually that there's actually no evidence that there's anything required in biochemistry for the transition from apes to humans that would pose a waiting time problem.
Okay.
So you'd have to actually find examples of that, and he can't find any. So that's why he focuses on bacterial evolution, which I think is actually really entertaining in a lot of ways, because he entirely thinks that we share common ancestry with the great apes. And a lot of the people citing him as evidence against human evolution have seemed to really miss this basic point that he doesn't dispute human evolution. He just thinks that at some point God had to be involved in order to produce a fully human soul, but he doesn't claim to have any biochemical evidence for it.
Well, I think what I hope your answer just did is it allowed the skeptics in the group, the post-fundamentalist skeptics, if you will, to see you as a friend. You have made that clear throughout this whole entire conversation.
I'm not a fundamentalist. This actually gets to something we were talking about before we started, right? I think you're talking about like the post-fundamentalists. Well, yeah, so I'm a post-fundamentalist too.
Yeah, they've left, or they're considering leaving Christianity because of the non-adoption of science.
They should leave American Christianity for sure. I mean, goodness sakes, leave that.
Yes.
Leave the common forms of American evangelicalism you see. But here's the thing, though. I left that too. But what I did is I returned to a more traditional, more international faith that is not post-evangelicalism or more progressive. It's actually, and it's not regressive either. It's just a return. It's a rediscovery. It's a rediscovery of what American evangelicalism lost. It's more grounded in things that It's ironic, actually. In a lot of ways, it just doesn't fit current categories. But I think that's really where I go through this. I mean, I left the young Earth creationism and the fundamentalism that I was raised in. And I mean, I was born and raised in the American church, but also, I'm an Indian immigrant. And so when I think about evangelicalism, I don't just think about like the white evangelicalism we see in the United States. I mean, I'm thinking about the missions movement, and I'm thinking about what's gone on in other countries, and the Lausanne Covenant,
Yeah,
which is antithetical to American evangelicalism as you can get. It's not initiated by only Americans. It was John Stott there. It involved Christians from across the globe, and articulating like fundamental beliefs to enable cooperation across differences, rather than establish purity in a narrow sense. I mean, it's completely the opposite of American evangelicalism. It's also clearly opposed to nationalism and that narrow approach. I mean, I think if we return to things like the Lausanne Covenant, if we returned to the sorts of principled tolerance and diversity, that sort of more traditional sort of Christianity, that was not oppositional to science,
right.
but actually the place out of which much of science was born, we would be in a much better place. So yeah, by all means, leave American evangelicalism and come follow Jesus to a better place.
Exactly. That's one of the things that I hope my audience can continue to do. So I want to take a little bit of a turn. Let's try to address some of these theological and philosophical issues. And again, they're going to interact with the science. You're a scientist. You're very well versed on the theology as well. So that's one of the reasons that I loved your book and loved this content, loved this conversation. So I think one of the most significant theological problems for any model, any particularly scientific model, is going to run into things like the fall. We do have Adam and Eve eating the fruit in the garden, and then there seems to be this report of physical effects on creation post the fall, or post, eating the fruit. So how does your model account for the fall in general?
Well, I mean, I wrote a lot about this in the book, right? And there's been a lot of theologians responding to it. What did you think about what I wrote?
Well, again, I would pretty much say that I adopted most of your model. I mean, and I say most only because I can't think of every nook and cranny, which is one of the reasons that I enjoy talking to you.
You have a little wiggle room.
A little wiggle room, yeah. and I haven't heard Craig's full argument in his book either, so I'll kind of balance these. But it was your whole perspective, your whole model of dealing with the fall and some of these other theological answers was fantastic as far as I'm concerned. So that's why I'm interested to hear kind of my audience.
Well, what I would say is
I
put forward specific ideas there, but I do think the right way to approach this is to understand that it's not really about the answers we have; it's about the questions we bring.
Sure.
And if you look at the Christian tradition, there are quote unquote answers, but what's been far more interesting for me as a scientist studying historical theology is to understand theology not as like a wooden statement of things that we must believe or not, but rather as a living conversation that's continuous to the past and then continues to this point. And so we have an opportunity to join a conversation about some really grand questions. And so there's a fundamental tension in the Christian faith that I believe actually deeply is concordant with our experience of reality, which is that we're in the image of God, yet we're fallen. That there's something sublime and transcendent about the human experience, but also something deeply broken about it. And both those realities are true and natural to who we are, or at least they appear to be natural. Now, the radical claim of Christianity is that it's not that it's a fundamental intended yin-yang, but rather that the fallen part can be fully excised, and in fact it will. And that also will struggle to identify at times we know that the world is fallen. I mean, I don't know anyone who disagrees with that. It's a broken world. But once again, it's a fairly radical claim, which is actually deeply concordant with our experience of the world, is that we struggle to understand exactly, I mean, even though we know it's broken, we struggle to actually identify to the extent to which it's broken and where it's broken. Just look at the contemporary conversations about race and systemic racism. Right. and the difficulty that people have acknowledging systems that that are just undeniably set up with racist intent, that have racist effects, but people were really resistant to even thinking about that because they personally don't have a racist intent.
Right. Right.
And I mean, what's going on there? It's just because the fall just invades our reality and it makes it seem like this is the way it's supposed to be, even though when it's really not. So that's, I think, the reality of Christian theology, which I think rather than trying to fight for its relevance, my starting point is that question is obviously relevant. And so the question then becomes, how is it that the actions of ancestors in our past can completely pollute the well for us in relationships with each other and with God? And I think we know for a fact that the decisions of ancestors can do that. So now we have a question ahead of us, or behind us, if you consider the fact that this is an old question.
Right.
I'm trying to wrestle through that. And there's different Christian traditions that have different emphases as they work through it. But really, I think the invitation for Christians and also people who are not Christian is to engage that question about that grand question about human nature, about the nature of the good, and about how we're connected to history and the entailments it places on us, and how we can work for a better sort of world now. And maybe have grounds for hope that God himself might even give us something better in the end than we could reach by ourselves.
Well, that's very well said. Let's get to kind of the magnum opus question that we've addressed. Where did Cain's wife come from? And again, this is going to kind of open us up for a number of questions that we can dialogue about. But what would your answer be to where did Cain get his wife from?
Well, I would say is that there's no innovation to Christian theology to recognize that for thousands of years, people have wondered that maybe there was just other people God had made outside the garden. And it wasn't evolution that made people think that. It wasn't even the old age of the earth. It was just the actual text of Genesis that made people wonder that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Now, I'm very aware of these really creative gap theories that young earth creationists and others will put forward. You can call them gap theories or incest theories or whatever. Right. I mean, I guess you could do those backflips, but why? When, it's not really something you have to do. I mean, so I just think that, you could do those backflips. I just think that ends up really altering what the text says. I think that text is pretty, seems to be pretty clear to me, is that, God created Adam and Eve in the Adamah, to inhabit the garden. And eventually to be a blessing across the entire earth. That's why they're given the command to spread across the entire earth. But the Eretz was a larger place, and there were already people out there that God had made. And when they're expelled from the garden, they ended up meeting these other people in a fallen state and intermingling with them. I think that's just like a very plain, obvious reading of Genesis.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things where, as you were explaining it in your book, I guess the typical mantra has been, and the typical answer that I've given has been, Genesis 2 is kind of a zoomed in view of day 6 in Genesis 1. And your contention was that Genesis 1 was largely separated from Genesis 2. Genesis 1 was talking about, yes, you have the creation of the animals and the plants, and you also have creation of people, of Adam, of the human race. That's what the
Well, if you look at my
means.
phrasing, it's a little more circumspect than that precisely. The key part that I would say I am very certain of is that there are two accounts. There's Genesis 1 and there's Genesis 2.
Right.
I think a fundamental question is how those two relate. Now, I don't take a strong position either way. I see a lot of legitimacy to the sequential view, which is the idea that Genesis 1 happens first, and then at a later time, Genesis 2 happens.
Right.
But that's not necessary. So, for example, Jack Collins and Mike Heiser would say, no, that there's enough textual reasons to think that these things are bound together. I don't know how they rule out the idea that they're typologically bound together, but not bound together by the exact historical events. They haven't explained that to me.
Right.
But let's say we even say that they're just describing the same physical events in different ways. They still think that Genesis 1 is talking about a broader event that's over potentially it's definitely over a larger time span, and also over a larger geographic scope than what happens in Genesis 2. So then nothing in Genesis 1 says that God only made one couple. He could have made a lot of couples. And he doesn't say how he made them. So
Right.
maybe he made them by a process of evolution. And then Genesis 2 tells us about one of the couples that he made. So in the end, I just don't see how you could really claim that that's in conflict with the idea of people outside the garden. The only way to really to do that is if you're really coming with a lot of strong preconceptions about what Scripture must tell us, that you then read into it. But I don't think that that's a good way to read Scripture. I mean, I'm not trying to read evolution into it. I mean, I can show with evidence that it's not evolution that leads people to think this about Scripture. Certainly not what led me to think this. I was wondering about this when I was a young Earth creationist that rejected evolution. What really is there is just what the actual text of Genesis says. When you actually read what Genesis says, even, I would say that the reading that I really put forward is a more literal reading than young Earth creationism. So the issue is not even a literalism.
Right.
I mean, you could take a literalistic, inerrantist, Chicago Statement's view of hermeneutics that doesn't even engage ancient Near Eastern literature if you want. And this would be a plausible answer. Now, at the same time, taking into account ancient Near Eastern literature doesn't undermine it either. I mean, if you actually look at the comparators in ancient Near Eastern literature, the idea of God especially creating a couple to influence everyone outside that space, is actually what you actually see in Gilgamesh. And so it's comfortably aligned with, ancient Near Eastern literature to propose a model like this.
Well, I think one of the things that your book does, at least it did for me, is it really deflated the conflict between kind of the science and the young Earth creationist perspective. Do you feel like you've seen some of that fruit where people are emailing you or contacting you and being like, wow, similar to what I'm saying?
I think that's
really
definitely the case. I mean, there's a lot of people of all sorts that react to it on a very personal level of like, oh, this has just really helped me. I really struggle with this and it really helped me. And I've also really, I talked about how some have really reacted very personally negatively because a big part of their identity and their journey was this conflict, which ended up playing a really central role in a decision they made in the future and a path they took. But if that conflict isn't there, it's just been very hard for them to think through that. Now, some of the best of them, where I have a great deal of respect, they go back and reconsider some of those decisions too and think, well, wait a minute. If I made this decision purportedly because of science, but science doesn't actually say that, maybe I really need to really rethink through this. Maybe there's other reasons to make that decision, but we have to really reconsider it. I think that has integrity. I mean, other people, I think it's really touched a lot of people personally that way. I think, for example, old Earth creationists at Reasons to Believe, it's just been an immense sense of relief. A really great response to read is, we did a conference with them back in right when the book came out, which I think is really worth watching and listening to. Yeah. But AJ Roberts wrote a really excellent response to the book that came out in Sapientia, which I just highly recommend looking at. It's just beautiful to see their desire to really find peace, even with evolution as old Earth creationists. And then, Bill Craig is another example. His book is coming out, in September. And, he's been in tension, really agreeing with mainstream science on old Earth and Big Bang, which is a big part of his work in apologetics, but really because of misrepresentation of science is what it comes down to by Christians, ironically, that affirmed evolution, but really felt the need to dispute what theology he thought was important, like monogenesis. Right. He just found himself in conflict with evolution and was really trying to work through that. We had the good fortune of meeting each other and kind of clearing up that misrepresentation of science really just took away the conflict. So his book, I think, is a major, major cultural event for Christians because he is very much in the conservative realm, yet his book is entirely aligned with mainstream evolutionary science, and that's good news. Yeah. I mean, another thing too is like Baptists are another place where there are. I mean, it's another great example where there's a large number of theologians that are okay with evolution, but they just disagree with, the post-evangelicalism and the approaches to evolutionary science from a theological point of view that have been taken by, for example, biologos and evolutionary creationists.
Right.
They can't go with that. They're committed to inerrancy. Biologos is not. They have a different view of scripture and these things, but they're not opposed to evolutionary science. So Ken Keithley is a theologian out at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, one of their leading seminaries. He's having me come out as a visiting scholar this next year.
Wow, that's awesome.
And he responded at ETS to my book really positively, saying, this actually really solves the issue in fundamental ways for him in a way that's deeply consistent and continuous with his tradition. Now, I'm not Baptist, but Baptists are the largest denomination in the United States, and they have a large number of young earth creationists. And I've been getting invited back regularly to speak to seminary classes that are full of young earth creationist theologians, where they're engaging and thinking about this deeply. This is stuff that people didn't know was possible in terms of movement we could make just a few years ago. And it really just comes from really, I think, trying to take a more grounded approach scientifically on one hand, but also an approach that seeks to be continuous with historical Christianity rather than critiquing it.
Right.
So I think the right, I think there's a lot of reasons to reject American Christianity.
Right.
I could give you probably a longer list than you have. I'm deeply disillusioned to the point where I struggle to restrain myself from saying things that are going to really create problems. Okay. But I'm not called to follow American Christianity. I'm called to follow Jesus, and he's good.
Yeah.
And I'm called to follow the movement of believers that began 2,000 years ago and be part of that church. And that church is discontinuous and in critical ways from American evangelicalism. And I think that that it was really a return to that type of traditional Christianity. It's rooted in the creeds. It's rooted in things like the Lausanne Covenant more recently, and international Christianity. And what Dennis McKinnon, we talked about his book, You Lost Me.
Right.
One of the surprising things in his book, as he found out, is that a large number of the nuns, a large number of those people leaving the church, quote unquote, were like me. And what he tells us is exiles. Is that we're the exiles. The misunderstanding is that we're rejecting Christianity, is that we're rejecting traditional, but actually most of us, what we do is we're actually rejecting the deviations from like a grounded historical Christianity that we see. And we really want something better, not something, we want to see like a new wine poured out from historical Christianity. We don't want a grand revision of the faith. We want a grand revision from the faith that we've encountered, but a revision back to what it was, or we want a recovery is another way to put it. We want a revision of what we've seen that would recover a grounded faith, a faith that is not in conflict with science, but it's also not in conflict with fundamental teachings of scripture and all that. And the big choking point for a lot of people has been evolution. That's a place where it seemed like, it does seem like science is going to require some revisions of doctrines like monogenesis and in our understanding of God's action in the world. So even though it really seems that it teaches that Adam and Eve were created without parents, we have to reject that now because of science. It just turns out that we were wrong about the science. It turns out that there's really no reason to reject monogenesis or even de novo creation. So what exactly is the conflict? I think that's the real question going forward on human evolution, in light of how we're kind of coming back to understanding what the science really says.
Well, Dr. Swamidas, I really appreciate your insight on all of this. And what I would say is if you're open to it, maybe I'll have you back on to talk about those differences between traditional Christianity and American Christianity. So if my audience would love to have Dr. Swamidas back on to talk about some of those things, you can go ahead and leave a comment and let us know, and we'll try to set that up in the future and really dive in deep because, man, a lot of what you're saying I'm resonating with, and I know my audience is as well. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I look forward to that conversation. I think it honestly is really close to the journeys we're on, right?
Yeah.
And I think there is a grand reassessment, frankly, for good reason,
Yeah.
of the political nationalistic, I'm going to get accused of CRT, but I'm not talking about critical race theory, but white types of Christianity.
Right.
So you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yep.
Can you vouch for me that I'm not talking about CRT?
Yep. I've had
The
this
fact
conversation.
that even I have to say that kind of points to major problems.
Right. Totally.
In the conversation, where we've really not been a redemptive influence in broken areas of society like race.
It's true. It's very true. Yeah.
And I just think that there's an opportunity for a better way. And what gives me the most hope is that when I talk to almost every Christian I talk to that's younger than me, when I talk about that better way, they first of all know that the current way it is done is broken, and they are ready to sign up and looking for leaders to take them that better way. And I think some of them will become those leaders that take us that better way.
No, that's fantastic. Well, hopefully you as the audience, Joshua Swamidas, gave you some hope and broadened your mind when it comes to the way that we think about some of these ideas, when it comes to how we read the Bible and evolutionary science, and really looking forward to a future conversation where we dive deep into American Christianity and American evangelicalism, and we kind of look at the different pieces when it contrasts with traditional Christianity. I'm excited for that conversation. If you're excited for that conversation, let us know again in the comments, and we'll try to do our best to make that happen here in the near future. So with that, I will leave you, as I always do, with inviting you to continue to doubt towards faith. We'll see you next time on Dealing with Deconstruction.